Hello, government students. Yesterday we looked at the different forms of government, looking at them on a spectrum from those types of governments that have the most individual freedom and liberty to those that have the least individual freedom and liberty. And of course we looked at some kind of odd amalgamations of different types of governments like oligarchies and aristocracies and plutocracies, that sort of thing. Today we're going to be looking at the political spectrum, left versus right. Left meaning very, very liberal, perhaps. Right meaning very, very conservative. Typically, when we look at the left versus right dichotomy, the left would say that society should strive for complete socio-economic equality of all individuals. And on the right, the far right, we might say that socio-economic inequality is unavoidable, may even be desirable, and so everyone kind of falls between these two extremes. So let's go ahead and get started and look at the different types of socioeconomic systems, beginning with the far left. Some of this will be very familiar to you from our look at different types of economic systems, because really we're talking about that again in the way, though, that the economic systems are reflected in political systems as well. So the far left, we have communism, and you might remember that communism technically is the common ownership of all productive property. Productive property is that property which can be used to create wealth. From an economic standpoint, we're talking about the factors of production, land, labor, capital, that sort of thing. Property is controlled by the communist government, and that communist government theoretically represents everyone. And of course, the government in a communist society is most likely to be authoritarian. Very little individual liberty typically in a communist system. As we move further to the right, we're still on the left, but now we've moved to socialism. Okay, socialism, government controls the productive property that is essential to the society's well-being. And usually in a socialist system, we're talking about utilities like the electricity, natural gas, water, that sort of thing. Banks might be controlled by the government, and other labor-intensive industries where you have specific industries in which a big part of the population works. Those might be controlled by the socialist government. Private ownership typically is okay if that if that industry or business is not considered essential to society. So, I was in East Germany when East Germany was a communist country, and there were still some private companies doing business even in East Germany. Bakeries, for example, might be owned by a private individual. However, the company that made the dough and the flour, that sort of thing, that might have been controlled by the government. But the bakery itself at the retail level might have been a private business. Typically in a socialist country, you might have situations where labor and community representatives would be on a corporate board of directors, and that has existed in Scandinavia, where labor unions get to sit on the board of directors of a corporation. That would never happen in the United States, but it could happen in certain countries that are more socialistic than the United States. And in a socialist system, the government may be democratic, it may be authoritarian. It could be anywhere within that spectrum that we looked at in our previous lesson. Then we get to the center when you have a mixed economic system, and that means that you're going to have some government involvement in economic activity, but the government won't get involved in as much as in a socialist system. And the government will tend to be more democratic in a mixed system, but it could be authoritarian as well. Private ownership will exist for most productive property, but not all productive property. Let's look at how in a mixed economy the government does get involved. The government will own certain industries, for example. In the United States, I could give you an example. The government owns the U.S. Postal Service, and the government owns the passenger train service. There can be price regulations, so especially like in utilities where electricity has a cap on what the electric company can charge. There can be safety regulations. Anti-monopoly regulations, meaning we don't want one company to control an entire industry. We can have tariffs and taxation that might be different for different industries or different companies. Government subsidies. We talked about subsidies in economics. The government might help out by providing tax breaks or cash payouts to certain companies or businesses. You can have publicly owned land. So all these are areas where the government gets involved in the economy. Not as much as in a socialist system, but still the government is involved. Here's an example. You might be surprised of just how much public land there is in the United States. That is land that is owned by the national federal government. Any color you see there is government-owned land. It's a lot, especially out west. And that doesn't even include state-owned land. This is federal land that is owned. It's a lot. Okay, as we move to the right, now we're getting into laissez-faire capitalism. Okay, laissez-faire, French for let it alone. Here we have private ownership of all productive property. That is, land, labor, and capital will all be privately owned. There is no government involvement in the economy at all. Laissez-faire capitalism grew out of the Industrial Revolution, and oftentimes we call that classic economic liberalism. Liberalism in the economic sense does not mean the same thing as liberalism in the political sense. Economic liberalism is basically based on the writings of Adam Smith, and in Adam Smith's writings we have the recommendation that government should not get involved in the economy at all, that we should have economic freedom, total economic freedom, and that is the most efficient way for the economy to work for everyone in economic liberalism or laissez-faire capitalism. And then we get to the far right, and the far right is represented by fascism. Excuse me. In fascism, again, you might remember this, ownership of productive property is limited to racial, ethnic, or national elites. The government may control how that productive property is used. In economics, we talked about Volkswagen, how Volkswagen was privately owned by the same company, the same man that started Porsche. But even though he owned the productive property, Hitler told Porsche that he had to make an affordable car for all Germans, which became the Volkswagen. Fascism may include elements of socialism for the favored ethnic or racial groups. In fact, we know that the Nazi Party was called the National Socialist Party. It really wasn't a socialist government. It wasn't a socialist economic system, but there were elements of socialism in that party, in that system, that favored the ethnic German population. And then the government itself is likely to be controlled by those same racial or ethnic or national elites. Sometimes the industrial elites will control the government. If there's a particular industry that's especially vital within a country, the owners of those industries may control the government of the country, and that has been the case oftentimes in places like Central America, where there's very little in the way of diversification of the economy. So where you have an economy controlled by one industry or one company, that company and that industry could control the government. And finally, in a fascist system, there tends to be the glorification of the state and of the military. Fascist countries tend to be very, very militaristic. And even when you get to the far left, communism, it starts to resemble fascism in some ways, where there can also be a glorification of the state and of the military. We certainly have seen that in many communist countries as well as fascist countries. Okay, so if we look at this as a spectrum running from left to right, we see then that communism is on the far left, then you have socialism, then in the middle you have the mixed economy, and then you have on the right, center right, the laissez-faire capitalism, and then on the far right, fascism. Now in the United States, we don't have parties that go by those names, not typically anyway. Our two political parties are Democrats and Republicans, and a handful of others. But our political parties are pretty much centrist parties. They are more or less in the middle, but the Democrats tend to be a little bit left of center. Republicans tend to be right of center. But nevertheless, very few Republicans would consider themselves laissez-faire capitalists. Very few Democrats consider themselves socialists. There are a few who might, but the party as a whole does not. There's a few Republicans who might consider themselves laissez-faire capitalists, but the party as a whole is not that. And sometimes you'll hear politicians refer to politicians of the other party, like some Democrats may refer to some Republicans as being fascist, or some Republicans may refer to Democrats as being socialists or even communists. That's nonsense. It truly is nonsense. And don't listen to people when they say that. Both parties are pretty much centrist for the most part. So, yesterday we talked about the political forms of government, and we looked at them ranging from more libertarian types of systems like direct democracies to authoritarian types of systems, and today we're looking at left versus right. So I'm placing the political spectrum that we looked at yesterday with the political spectrum that we're looking at today, and it's formed sort of a cross. Okay, so everyone falls in one of these quadrants that you're looking at, and if I fill them in, that's kind of how it looks like, running from the north-south axis. We begin at the bottom with the most libertarian form of government being a direct democracy. Then we move up to representative democracies or constitutional monarchies. Moving up, we get above the center and we get into the one-party state, and then the dictatorships and absolute monarchies. Other types of governments that we talked about, like oligarchies and plutocracies and theocracies, they can all fall somewhere within that spectrum. So a theocracy or an oligarchy could be a representative democracy. It could be a dictatorship. It could fall anywhere in there. So these are the main ones, though. And then looking left to right, you see how it goes from communism all the way over to fascism. So that's sort of the grid, and we all should fit somewhere within that grid. Now, you have a homework assignment. I want you to figure out where you fit in that political spectrum. So you're going to go to that website that you see there, and you're not going to, when you look at it, you're going to see a green button you could click on for start. Don't click on that. I believe that's for an advertisement if you see that. Just scroll down and you'll see where the quiz actually begins. It's going to take you 5 or 10 minutes to complete the quiz. And at the end of that quiz, you're going to be given a score on the political spectrum. I want you to print that or take a screenshot of your score if you're doing it at home online, and then I want you to turn that in, either a printout of your score on the spectrum or a screenshot, and see where you are on the political spectrum. You might be a little bit surprised. You might think that you're a conservative and you come out being a little bit more on the liberal side, or vice versa. It'll be interesting for you to find that out. And with that, we're going to stop for the day. Do your little homework and have a great, great day. Let's see if you're a liberal or a conservative. Talk to you later.